When we talk about terrorism, we often imagine modern threats, extremist groups armed to the teeth, or hackers breaking into systems. However, history knows examples where terror has come not from the outside but from within society, feeding on its fears and weaknesses. One such example is the organization known as Aum Shinrikyo, or Higher Truth. This cult, which emerged in Japan in the late 1980s, became a symbol of chaos and destruction, bringing the country one of the worst tragedies in its modern history. But how could a small group of enthusiasts turn into an organization capable of paralyzing an entire city? To understand this, we need to look into the past, the story of its leader, ideology, and actions. It is a story not only of religious fanaticism, but also of how a society can be vulnerable to manipulation and fear. After World War II, Japan experienced incredible economic growth, becoming one of the world's leading powers. However, this progress was accompanied by social problems. Many people felt lost in a rapidly changing world. Traditional values were giving way to new technologies, and the older generation was often marginalized. It was in this atmosphere that new religious movements emerged, promising their followers meaning and salvation. Born into a poor family in Kumamoto Prefecture, the future cult leader, known as Shoko Asahara, was doomed to hardship from childhood. Congenital glaucoma robbed him of his sight almost completely, making his life at a school for blind children a real challenge. But instead of becoming a victim of circumstance, he chose the path of dominance. Even in his youth, Asahara was known as a bully who extorted money from his classmates. Over time, however, his interest shifted towards spiritual development. Immersing himself in religion became not only a means of self-discovery, but also a tool of manipulation. Disillusioned with traditional Buddhism, which he believed had lost its purity, Asahara created his own belief system, combining elements of Buddhism, Christianity, and yoga. He claimed to possess supernatural powers, including levitation and the ability to cleanse sins. In reality, all of his miracles were either fakes or the result of masterful propaganda. His worldview was shaped by many factors. On the one hand, it was a reaction to the rapid changes in Japanese society after World War II. Cities, technology, and political structures were changing so rapidly that some people had a sense of alienation and distrust of the new world. On the other hand, Asahara was obsessed with the idea of Armageddon, which he believed would wipe out most of humanity. Only those who joined his cult would survive. In 1984, Asahara opened a yoga and meditation class in one of Tokyo's busiest neighborhoods, Shibuya. This was the beginning of his path to power. His teachings attracted those searching for meaning in a rapidly changing world. After being officially recognized as a religious corporation in 1989, the number of followers increased dramatically. By the early 1990s, the cult numbered about 10,000 and had a capital of more than 500 million yen. Behind the facade of spiritual enlightenment, however, there were gruesome realities. Former members recounted stories of torture, inhumane conditions, and human experimentation. Nevertheless, due to its status as a religious organization, there were no serious investigations. It is interesting to note that Aum Shinrikyo's success depended largely on effective propaganda. The cult used popular media formats of the time, such as anime and magazines, to attract young people. They even set up their own animation studio, producing a 10-part anime series called Transcendental World, which featured their leader's search for ultimate truth and greatness. This approach was extremely successful, especially among young people who were searching for meaning in a socially unstable life. Shoko Asahara was more than just a cult leader. He was a master manipulator, using his knowledge of psychology and religion to control people. His childhood spent in poverty and deprivation shaped his desire for power. He saw himself as the chosen one who must save humanity from impending disaster. His prophecies about the end of the world resonated with those who felt lost in the modern world. Joining Aum Shinrikyo can be explained by several factors. Search for meaning in life. Many followers were young people who felt lost in a rapidly changing world. Asahara's promises of ultimate truth and salvation from impending Armageddon resonated with those seeking spiritual enlightenment. Fear manipulation. Asahara used fear of the future by talking about an inevitable war between Japan and the United States that would wipe out most of humanity. He claimed that only members of his cult would be able to survive. Isolation and pressure. After joining the cult, people were placed in an isolated environment where they were subjected to psychological pressure. They were made to believe that the outside world was dangerous, and all problems could only be solved within the cult. Economic motives. Some wealthy members joined the cult to gain access to the special truth that Asahara promised. They gave their money and possessions to the cult, making them dependent on it. Asahara was a master of psychological manipulation. Here are some of his methods. Media propaganda. The cult set up its own animation studio and produced a 10-part anime series, Transcendent World, which featured the greatness of Asahara and his teachings. It attracted the attention of young people. False miracles. Asahara claimed that he could levitate and purify sins. In reality, all his miracles were either fake or the result of special effects. Training and torture. Cult members had to undergo harsh training, including prolonged immersion underwater, substance abuse, and mental trauma. This made them more docile and dependent. Isolation. Followers were completely isolated from the outside world, making them vulnerable to manipulation. Asahara was obsessed with the idea of Armageddon. He claimed that a war would break out between Japan and the United States that would wipe out most of humanity. Only those who joined his cult would survive. These prophecies became the basis for the radicalization of the followers. Aum Shinrikyo's activity was not limited to Japan. In Russia, the cult found thousands of followers, establishing connections with high-ranking officials. This allowed them access to military technology and training. Interestingly, many Russian members of the cult believed in Asahara's prophecies about the end of the world and were preparing for Armageddon. In 1992, Asahara traveled to Moscow, where he opened a branch of the cult. This brought him more than 30,000 new followers, including high-ranking officials such as Vice President Alexander Rudskoy and Ruslan Khasbulatov, chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. These connections allowed the cults access to military weapons, personnel, and training. Aum Shinrikyo was also active in other countries, including Australia, where they bought a sheep farm to test chemical weapons. This shows how global the cult's influence was. By opening a branch in Moscow, Asahara attracted over 30,000 new members. This gave him access to military weapons, personnel, and training. Although attempts to mass-produce Kalashnikov assault rifles failed, the cult was successful in developing chemical and biological weapons. The first major attack occurred in 1994 in Matsumoto. The targets were 3 judges who were to rule against the cult in a land dispute. Sarin gas released into the air killed 7 people and injured hundreds. However, police were unable to link the attack to Aum Shinrikyo, which only reinforced the cult's confidence in its impunity. Sarin is a nerve agent that blocks the transmission of signals in the nervous system. It causes convulsions, asphyxiation, and death. The production of such weapons requires considerable scientific knowledge and resources. Aum Shinrikyo was able to attract chemists, biologists, and engineers to join their ranks, allowing them to set up their own laboratory. This was made possible by the cult's financial resources and international connections. The March 20th, 1995 attack was one of the most carefully planned and brutal acts of domestic terrorism in Japanese history. 5 members of the Aum Shinrikyo cult, acting on a predetermined plan, boarded 3 different Tokyo subway lines, the Hibiya, Chiyoda, and Marunouchi. Uchi. They all converged at Kasumi Gaseki Central Station, where hundreds of thousands of people pass through every day. Each participant carried packets of liquid sarin wrapped in newspaper. After the train pulled away from the starting station, they would pierce the packets with the tip of an umbrella or other sharp object. Sarin is a nerve agent that vaporizes quickly on contact with air. It blocks the transmission of signals in the nervous system, causing convulsions, asphyxiation, vomiting, and eventually death. The gas began spreading through the rail cars almost instantly. In some cases, passengers noticed a strange odor similar to paint or fruit and saw drops of liquid on the floor. However, many did not realize what was happening until they began to feel the symptoms of poisoning: headaches, nausea, and difficulty breathing. In one case, a passenger even tried to wipe up the liquid with a rag, which only worsened the situation as he became a victim of poisoning himself. Initially, emergency responders faced serious difficulties. Because no one knew what had happened, initial reports of the incident were highly inconsistent. Many victims were taken to hospitals with a diagnosis of acute allergic reaction or food poisoning. Only hours later, it became clear that the cause was nerve gas. Rescuers and medics were working in high-risk conditions because they did not have adequate protection against chemical weapons. Some subway staff and police officers were also injured while trying to evacuate people. In all, more than 1,000 emergency workers were deployed to help transport victims to hospitals and decontaminate stations. After the attack, police raided the cult's headquarters, seizing vast quantities of weapons and banned substances. Asahara was arrested in 1995 and executed in 2018, along with other high-ranking members of the organization. The Tokyo subway terrorist attack came as a shock to the entire Japanese society. People began to wonder how such a thing could have happened in their country. The police and government were criticized for failing to prevent the attack. The laws on religious organizations were revised to prevent similar cults from appearing in the future. The story of Aum Shinrikyo has inspired many books, movies, and documentaries. It has come to symbolize how fear and manipulation can lead to disaster. The main lesson of this tragedy is the importance of critical thinking and protecting society from radical movements. After the terrorist attack, the Japanese government took a number of measures to prevent the emergence of new cults. Tightening laws. Changes were made to the laws on religious organizations to remove their immunity from investigation. Control of cults. All religious organizations are now under constant surveillance by the authorities. The story of Aum Shinrikyo is a cautionary tale of how fear and alienation can be used to create destructive movements. It reminds us of the importance of critical thinking and the need to protect society from manipulation. Although the cult has officially ceased to exist, its legacy continues to influence the modern world.